Welcome back everyone to Delta Y. This week we'll be talking about
Pig brains that have been partially revived 4 hours after death.
and a 3D printer that can print glass for optical fibers. As always, I'm Josh,
This is Grayson.
and welcome to Delta Y.
Alright, so our first article this week is going to be about how some researchers at Yale University have been able to revive pig brains, or partially revive pig brains, 4 hours after their death. This comes to us from BBC News. All articles, as mentioned, their links will be in the description below. So, the findings could fuel the debate about the barrier between life and death and provide new ways for researching diseases like Alzheimer's. 32 pig brains were collected from an abattoir, and 4 hours later, the organs were connected to a system made by a team at Yale University, which rhythmically pumped to mimic a pulse of a heart, a specially designed liquid round the brain, which contained synthetic blood to carry oxygen and drugs to slow or reverse the death of brain cells.
This is really interesting because they're talking about the stops of synapse death, or synapse destruction, which is really interesting to me because that is the fundamental part of your brain essentially, and this is a huge achievement I think in technology, in science and technology, because they're essentially reversing a very natural thing here, and they're doing it with technology. But this is something that I think is going to take a lot more time to find good uses for it. But for now, I think this is a great scientific achievement, and studying the brain in this way is going to be very helpful, I think, as well. Like you said, for Alzheimer's, but there's a lot of different brain diseases. I think that they could help, look in, how you could use this to, research them more, or possibly develop, good cures for them.
Yeah, well, the main portion of this research was dedicated to helping research Alzheimer's, which it's the main effect of Alzheimer's is just cell death in general, brain cell death. Although I guess this does also blur the line between life and death in a way.
They're hesitant right now to say that there's a difference because currently the pig's brains they were using never restored to full life. The brains were effectively silent in their in the ways they were. They were still technically brain dead.
I don't know about that because the thing that's interesting to me is because ethically speaking, they wanted to avoid that. And in order to do so, they were given drugs that would limit brain activity. Where was it?
I guess I didn't read that deep into it. So I guess, yeah, what you're saying is that they wanted no brain processes to occur because of that ethical boundary that they'd be crossing.
It says in here that if they did find some kind of brain activity, like complex brain activity that would be associated with more complex life and brain functioning, they would have immediately anesthetized and ended that brain's life, I guess. It's really weird having to talk about this.
The weird thing is now is, the trick is if they had done this without the chemicals to keep the brain in brain death, they would have fundamentally changed the medical field, radically because of how the medical field defines death is brain death. And if you bring a brain back from death, well, you've just created the biggest loophole in human history.
Okay, do they though? Do they define it as brain
so there's
death?
Because system death and brain death is what I think. They're not the exact terms, but it's a failure of certain organs versus so your body's death versus your brain's death. Yeah, because when your brain dies, technically you die. Your heart can stop, you can still be plenty alive.
Well, because they're like you see in most doctor or shows or Hollywood shows, or heck, even I think in some that you see people calling the time of death after they are unable to restart the heart, which I think, even if that is a real thing, I don't even know if it is, because generally it's an easy metric. But.
Yeah, so that is the general metric they use. So what they'll do is they'll call death by the time a heart stop, but they aren't legally allowed to declare you dead, I believe, unless you're brain dead, which is a certain time of deterioration past the point of all blood flow in your body, and it's a calculated amount of time.
Yeah, which is interesting because these were 10 hours. The pigs were they were given this sort of process 10 hours after they were, I might as well just say it, they were decapitated from the abattoir, or however the heck you pronounce the name. But it was 32 brains that were I guess resuscitated. I don't really know the correct
I
term
don't,
for
I
it.
don't know if there is a term for this yet.
Because it says functionally they were still dead brains. I mean, they were able to pump oxygen into it and a drug cocktail of some kind to restore some function, just not enough complex function that could be considered life, I guess.
And I think the trick was that the point of it was to avoid the dictation of life. They didn't want to reach that point. They wanted to reach, a stop of synapse breakage, of synapse death, of cell death in the brain, but they didn't want to cross that boundary of revival. And that was the trick with this.
Yeah,
And
so
a good thing to mention that I don't think Grayson pointed out yet was these were not these were not pigs raised for scientific
no,
reasons.
that's
These were pork pigs, so they were in line for the slaughterhouse for the meat markets.
yeah.
So this was,
Their sole purpose in life wasn't for this experiment to be killed. They were killed for other reasons, and then their brains were donated to science, essentially.
because they don't use the head in the meat industry.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, that's kind of on the ethical boundary of that. I don't know. It's an interesting idea in terms of like what we define as death at this point. I mean, you've got stuff like CRISPR babies now, which it's not directly correlated, but how that whole there's a bunch of, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a bunch of different progress being made in multiple different areas of just biology.
Yeah, and in the past few years, definitely, I agree with you. We've seen such a rapid increase in technologies for the brain and the body, and just stem cells have come such a long way in the past couple of decades, or even the past couple of years, that I think we're in a turning point for our society where we're going to see a lot of things rewritten in medical documentation in the next coming, I wouldn't say years, but decades of our lives, to the point where by the time we're old and in in our final years, we could be seeing our final years as completely different than what we see now for older people.
Yeah.
So we could be seeing our final years. We could still, we could look a lot different. We could have bone, just everything about us could be different because of
prosthetic implants.
Well, prosthetics and stem cells and just research like this into, this is essentially a brain health study to see, how you can preserve the body.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's kind of a big thing of science fiction, is preserving the body. How far can we stretch the human life? Can we stretch it, 150, 200, plus years? The trick there is just cell growth. I mean, I've read articles of, if we were able to stop so much cell death in our body, if we were able to slow that by half, we could, we'd have no problem living to be 200.
I think
as people.
I think part of that's more just the extension of a health span than as long as we're healthy, as long as we don't have any kind of disease or decrepitude slowly seeping in, I bet you we'd be able to live to 200 or something. It's mostly the aging that we have as we get older that decreases our ability to stay healthy. And if we're able to combat that through purging of senescent cells, or I forget what extending our telomere length, which is it's basically like a buffer zone for DNA of chromosomes, and as those start to get cut down, the effectiveness of our cells and cell regeneration also goes down as well. So increasing our health span would probably be the number one thing, but then
I mean, that is the point of, where you're really living. That's kind of up to the age of about 70 or so, 75 now. And really, in our modern society, we kind of call it the lifespan, but I really think we should start defining it as a health span in a lot of countries, to the point where it's from birth till when really you start to lose your functionality of life.
Well, not even functionality, just you start to encounter compounding problems like arthritis or some sort of scoliosis or some kind of even osteoporosis, bone problems. You start having GI and cardiovascular problems, or heck, even skin problems, because skin's the largest organ in the body. But you start having these problems that begin to compound themselves into other problems systemically. It may not, it could be a cancer. Cancer tends to do something like that. But even something as simple as a celiac disease that can compound, or even type 2 diabetes is actually a really good one, because there's a lot of people that don't take good care of their diet, and then that can compound into other issues across the body.
Yeah, really, the biggest problem I think with human health nowadays and the lifespan of humans is the trick that no one is really perfect at taking care of themselves. We all have flaws, and medically and genetically we have flaws. So that's the reason why it's not just it is partly, how we take care of ourselves, what we eat, how we exercise, everything like that. But it's also based on genetics. So I think that, we've seen a longer life. We've seen a growth in the lifespan of humans in the past 2 millennia, in the past couple thousand years.
Yeah.
And I think that, with the rapid growth of technology in the past century, we'll see that kind of exponentiate into the next few decades.
Yeah.
Where we could see, every generation, gain years in the tens.
Yeah.
And not just in single years.
Yeah, and it kind of goes like the whole genetic thing that you were talking about kind of goes back to what I was trying to get into a different topic regarding like the advancement of, say, CRISPR or gene editing for stuff like that. There's a whole ethical boundary. Like I remember I was talking back with what was it, the Chinese researcher, the Chinese genetic researcher, the CRISPR babies that have been shown to be resistant to HIV or
Wasn't
AIDS.
he imprisoned?
I'm not entirely sure. I
saw
haven't seen a lot of
him
articles recently about it.
Being in prison, but it's also he was in China, and there's a lot of strict laws there, I believe. So he might have just quote unquote disappeared.
Besides the point. The whole like ethical, there's a lot of ethics and a lot of ethical laws, or just a lot of rules that need to be followed for research like this to develop, and
that's exactly why they didn't bring this brain back quote unquote to life.
Well, I mean, I don't even think they could, because it was still technically brain dead.
Yeah, but they didn't want to bring it past that point because that's a big ethical bound, or just a boundary to cross. If they were to do that, this would have shaken up the entire medical industry around the world, undoubtedly.
Yeah, which is why they've pumped it full of a drug cocktail which limited brain activity, because even if it was alive, I don't know how I feel about that. Like, even if it was alive or was able to have the capacity to be deemed alive, they limited that, which is interesting from an ethical standpoint. I'd like to see the impetus behind that, but I guess
they did an EEG on it, and they didn't find brain-wide signals across the brain,
like alpha, theta, and gamma, or what? Alpha, delta,
pretty much
and
the
theta
EEG
waves.
said the brain was still dead.
Yeah.
And that was the biggest thing, is that they didn't want to bring about, awareness, perception, or anything like that in the brain. They wanted to keep it dead. And I think that, as humans, we're going to have to figure out, what our boundaries are for this, because this is a new emerging field of technology. So we have to work a little bit, in a lot of ways to find out, what can we do that isn't overstepping what we should do.
I actually really want to take like an ethics course, or some kind of like, if there's like a book or some kind of, if anyone that's listening right now has a book or a recommendation on just like basic ethics or biological ethics or medical ethics, a book or some kind of an online course or anything that's accessible through the internet, please comment down below. I'd actually be really interested to read something up on that, because I'm not a biologist. I'm only inputting just my own thoughts into the ether, but I'd actually be really interested to see how something like this plays in with, like, resurrection or pseudo-resurrection, something like that.
And those are big words, but I think it's a good way to, I'm saying big words in terms of ethical ways.
Yeah.
But I think that's a good point to transition into our next article, which is on researchers from the Optical Society in a university in Quebec, in Canada, have successfully 3D printed glass. And this isn't your standard glass. This glass is technically made for like optical fibers and sensors, and technically biomedical devices can use this too. And Grayson, do you know how to say this again? It's
chalcogenide, I think.
Chalcogenide glass. So they use it a lot for optical fibers because of its properties of being a little more forgiving than standard, silica carbide or silica glass, because standard glass that we think of today isn't Gorilla Glass. Just soda lime glass, stuff like that is just shattering.
Well, it's not even that it's shattering. It's just that we don't have I doubt you have a 3D printer that's able to melt stuff to the degree that glass is, and able to handle molten, like.
Not just that, but also the ion exchange process to actually get glass up to the strength that it would be. There's a reason they're using this certain type of glass, because the ion exchange process for soda lime glass and any other glasses is just a huge process that requires a lot of heat and time. And this is really interesting, because this could be a great way to create new biomedical devices. So implants that use this stuff, there's certain ways they use it. So they use it primarily, this type of glass, for optical fibers. And that's become a huge thing now for both lighting and communication.
Yep.
Because optical fibers can transmit data
Near
tens of times faster than anything we have right now.
It's
really.
close to like what we use for speed of light in terms of just like.
Well, it is the speed of light, technically.
I mean, close
It's
to it. It's
C
like
minus 5, we'll call it that.
C minus.
Like, it's so close to C. The trick is the resistivity. I mean, just the
because
inherent resistivity of glass.
Well, not
to light.
Not resist. It's the it's like I forget the refractive index
That.
from. Like it's like 1.33, I think, is what it is. That limits the wavelength or the speed that glass can like transmit light. It's not as fast as it would be going through air or vacuum, but it's still pretty darn fast compared to what we would be if we just laid down a bunch of copper wiring across the ocean.
Yeah, and these researchers are saying that they're envisioning a lot of thermal imaging uses for this, for security applications or defense, but also sensors for pollutant management, monitoring, and then biomedicine or applications where infrared chemicals.
Infrared chemicals.
Infrared chemical signatures of molecules for detection and diagnosis. That was a direct quote from this article.
Okay, because I actually have never heard of glass, like this kind of a glass, or even being used for biomedicine in any way, because I mean, I'm not one for more material science, I'm more electrical stuff, but this is actually pretty interesting to me as well.
Yeah, and this is really interesting because the printer only had to go up to 260 degrees, right around between 260 degrees and 330 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So way below the melting point of glass, but it was enough to soften it up so they could extrude it through the print head.
Interesting. So I'm guessing it's most likely a custom print head, but even something like that, I mean, what'd you say, a range of 300 to 600?
Around 300 degrees centigrade.
Around 300 degrees centigrade. Interesting.
Yeah. And it was so they increased that, Oh, sorry, I'm reading this completely wrong. So they increased the max temperature on this commercial 3D printer from 260 to 330 degrees centigrade.
Interesting,
to enable it to extrude.
That's only like a 50% more than what normal 3D printers print at for something like PLA.
Yeah, PLA prints at...
Like, what, 200? Something around 200, 210?
Yeah, depends on how you want to print it, but around 200 is not a bad number for PLA.
Yeah.
So this is, it's not that much more. It's really about 100 degrees C more, and really if you start getting into material sciences and how you construct when they're using a commercial printer, it's a lot different than what me and you would get for like a MakerBot or anything like that. They're using stuff that's, all metal, doesn't warp, made for this type of high heat setting for rapid reprinting. So, this is only really suited for soft glass, but they're also looking to, use this in other types of glass that, really could revolutionize the way we use glass more than the jump from just standard glass to Gorilla Glass in the past few decades.
Yeah, so,
And it's it's really interesting because that could mean a lot of different property devices could be using optical glass in them, and they could have it custom made, sort of like sensors and infrared devices, stuff like that. And like what they're saying, it really seems interesting because you could rapidly create things that are much more efficient than before. Not just in terms of a cable of optical fiber, but actual runs of optical strands inside of your device.
Yes, and the article actually states that 3D printed chalcogenide glass. What is it? It's like chalcogenide glass, I guess.
We'll call it chalcogenide, and we're going to completely butcher it, probably.
Yeah, probably. But that kind of base components would be very useful for infrared thermal imaging for defense and security applications. They would also enable sensors for pollutant. Yeah, so it's got biomedical, it's got sensor applications, pollutant monitoring, and now defense and security applications.
Really, you can use glass for whatever your mind thinks you could use a material for. It's such a versatile material that this is just another way to, create it so that it can be used and, molded into what you want.
Yeah.
A little bit differently than traditionally has been
silica
done.
glass.
Yeah. So, really the thing here is that they've discovered a way to use glass not for different things, but in a way that makes it easier for the things we've been using it for.
Like basically an easier way to apply the technology.
Exactly. And I think that's what they're going for here is just an ease of application. So if you want to create something complex, you don't have to create a mold and cast it and everything like that. You can print it and it'll be just as, valuable and, well-rounded as, a mold that is cast.
Well, okay, I'm actually looking at the image for it. This is on ScienceDaily.com that has the paper, or not the paper, but just the summary of the research. It doesn't look like it's not like an actual transparent glass from what I'm seeing. It doesn't seem like it's like a silica glass, obviously.
Yeah.
So it's not transparent, but it's got kind of like a orange reddish tint to it. I'm not sure if the yellow thing behind it is like a base or if that's another type of glass. Maybe it depends on the heat for it. I don't know.
That could be a heat thing, and there's also a ton of factors that can contribute to this. That's the interesting thing is that's surprisingly well detailed for 14 millimeters.
That's 14 millimeters.
Yeah. That's 14 millimeters long, and that is surprisingly detailed for 3D printing.
Yeah.
So, they're showing that they're able to do this in about the same resolution that standard
like FDM printing is.
Yeah. And so, it's not on the level of resin printing, but it's still really incredible to see, how exact they're getting this down. Mm-hmm. And, as a first go around on this, it's really promising to see, in the next couple of years, we'll be seeing more devices using optical, technologies in them to make them faster. Using by optical, more glass and things, which could be troubling if you drop your phone and you shatter a linkage between, your GPU or your CPU and your, your motherboard. But
because it's like it's more of a soft glass than something like silica.
Mm-hmm, definitely. So, this is definitely something to keep an eye on, I think, because this is, definitely a cost. A huge cost breakthrough. Mm-hmm. You're going to bring down the cost of this sort of material heavily compared to other things.
Yeah.
And that's going to bring down optical costs, for optical fiber and just other, like we were saying before, defense, imaging, stuff like that. Those sensors and everything there is going to come down drastically as well.
Yeah, and I kind of think, well, this is something that we learned recently, but it could be used as a dielectric for capacitors. So, we already have a 3D printable wire, essentially. And and then you have multiple print heads for 3D printers and stuff. So using that with 3D printable wire, you could theoretically make your own capacitor.
Yeah, you could 3D print a capacitor.
That
seems kind of scary to me.
Scary? Are you kidding me?
It's cool, but it's also like, think of how big of a capacitor you could print.
Well, think about the more technical stuff, I guess. But think about like how much capacitance you could get on something like that.
True.
Because like what it actually
efficiency of your print and everything like that.
Well, the efficiency of the capacitor itself. That too. Anyway, that's more just technical stuff that we won't get into too much. Yeah. But I think with that, we should probably wrap up this episode.
I agree, and we want to thank you all for listening again. As always, we'll put our articles down below and our links to our social media. We appreciate you guys listening every week. When you do, we're still trying to build this up. We're not the greatest at it, we know, but we want to, get better, and the only way is repetition. So, we missed a week there, we missed a week here. It'll definitely be interesting. One thing to look out for is we're not quite sure yet how we'll be doing this
over the summer.
We're living in different cities, so you might be seeing, one of us do an episode one week and one do the next week. But that's to be determined. But as always, we'll try to keep you updated. We'll let you know next week in our episode. And as always, thank you for watching. I'm Josh.
This is Grayson.
And thank you for listening to Delta Y.